Hello everyone, once again from the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, and when you're actually watching this, I actually won't be in Vietnam anymore. I'm probably in Japan, but I could also be in Korea. I am pre-making like 4 videos before I have a 2-week like kind of holiday around Japan and Korea before going back home after my like 7 months of traveling. And just one small tangent on Hanoi. So me and my girlfriend were getting like lunch and we were waiting for our cab on this street corner. And like some guy comes up to us, some American guy, and he seems to like be asking me for directions, or that's what I thought. He actually recognized me and he said he liked my videos, and then we had a good conversation. And this guy was called Colin, and he's the first person who's ever recognized me in real life, which is absolutely amazing considering I'm like thousands of miles from home or thousands of miles from where my biggest audience are in the UK and in America. So Colin, if you're watching this, I really appreciate you coming up to me just because it's really cool to see someone that you've never met before in person saying nice things about the videos you put out. Because it really feels like when you're making YouTube videos, it's like a really like isolating experience and you don't really think your words have impact on the world. So that was really nice to see. And also on that note, if you ever randomly see me on some random street corner in any part of the world, feel free to come up and say hello. I do really appreciate that. So I just thought that was cool. And I guess I'll always remember Hanoi for that at least. But moving away from that tangent, today we are talking about New Atheism. And I made a video like nearly 2 years ago called like the slow death of New Atheism and the YouTube skeptic community, and I rewatched that today and thought to myself, well, in that video I mostly talked about like the YouTube skeptic community and the impact of New Atheism on them. I didn't actually talk about like the New Atheist figures. And also, before people start getting butthurt in the comments saying that these people never called themselves New Atheists, it was a label given to them, I don't really care, to be honest, but I think it's a good categorization for a bunch of people who are Western chauvinist atheists, so I'm going to keep using New Atheism, and also everyone knows what New Atheism is anyway at this point. So today what I wanted to talk about was, from my perspective, the reasons I feel like New Atheism died as someone who was attracted to these thinkers and speakers when I was like a teenager, young adult, and talk about why I like rejected them at the end. And if you guys have been following my channel, I've made a lot of videos criticizing New Atheism over the years, and then I just want to talk about why they've kind of faded into irrelevancy and why like the political changes in the world have also kind of facilitated that. Because I don't know about you, like left-leaning atheists out there, I am much more concerned with capitalism now than I am with things like religion. Like, I am an atheist. I do think religion is firmly like a negative thing and stuff. But at the end of the day, I feel like my focus should be on like anti-capitalism rather than anti-religion. And we're going to talk about all of that today. But before we go any further, please like the video, and in the comments, let me know your experiences of atheism or New Atheism. Were you a fan of these people? I'm interested to know. And also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, but also on Instagram. Instagram is where I've been posting about my travels. Like I said, I'm probably in Japan or Korea right now, and I always post on my stories and I always archive them on my highlight reels on my profile page. So if you want to keep up with me in that way, please go check out the Instagram. And also, I've made some travel content for my Patreon page. I have a backlog of videos to record about my travels, but they are going to all go up at some point, and also you get access to the Discord server and my Nintendo Switch friend code. And I'm trying to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible. And if you care about any of that, please go check out the Patreon, and also check out my subreddit and check out my second channel down in the description. So 2 things I want to start with: my experience of like New Atheism and my view of it, and also the context that gave rise to New Atheism, like the historical context. So I know a lot of you guys already know this, but most people watching this video won't actually be subscribers of mine. I feel like I should explain it. So my grandparents are all Irish immigrants to the UK, all Catholics, of course. So I was raised in Catholicism. I went to Catholic primary school. I went to Catholic secondary school. I was even an altar server at our church. Always hated church, funnily enough. And looking back as a kid, I kind of like never believed in God or religion. Not saying that to sound like I'm smart, but I used to remember like kneeling after communion and thinking like, oh, this is so pointless, this is so dumb, no one hears me, no one's listening to our thoughts and our prayers. I've said this a couple of times, lucky enough for me that our Catholic schools were fairly progressive. You didn't have to be a Catholic to teach there. My first exposure to New Atheism was actually in religion class when I was 14, watching Richard Dawkins videos, going into like Muslim schools and trying to like debunk stuff they were teaching. So even in that way, in a Catholic school, I was exposed to new atheism and atheist like arguments. So I'd say, although I was raised in a religion, it really wasn't hammered into my head. I never felt Catholic guilt for like my sins as a teenager. Like I never had that drilled into me. When I was about 16, I remember like being an atheist, but because I'd only been exposed to Richard Dawkins, I didn't really identify as that because I thought he was just a dick. And I thought like if you were an atheist, you kind of had to like subscribe to people like him. But then as I got older, like maybe like 18, I started to become more like hardline atheist, like really thinking most of the world's problems were driven by religion. And I would say it was like the main thing in the world that was causing like fighting, causing division. Of course, when you're younger, you're a bit more ignorant about capitalism because you haven't really experienced the capitalist world and you haven't actually got an education to really analyze the world in that way. And especially when you're brought up in the West, you just think, well, capitalism can be bad. Like, what's the alternative? Like, socialism is good in theory, but look at all the socialist states and how they failed. Like, am I really supposed to think that's the alternative? So I guess I just focused on religion. And because I obviously grew up in the context of like the Bush era, Blair era, wars in Afghanistan, wars in Iraq, loads of conflict in the Middle East, the Arab Spring, refugee crisis, the news 24/7 was of course fear-mongering about Muslims, whether that be Muslim refugees, whether that be Muslim insurgents. It was pretty hard to find any positive coverage of anything to do with Islam when I was growing up, and in that context you have the new atheists making a resurgence. To me personally, I found it like quite appealing. I also started to believe that like Islam was a worse religion than other religions because look what's happening in the world. Sam Harris says they're following Islam closely and that's what makes them act like this. And because of their way of framing it, it did firmly make me think that Islam was a worse religion. And now I realize like a decade of being shaped by the media, a decade of being shaped by like films and everything, made me more susceptible to a more Islamophobic, Western chauvinist argument. Lucky enough for me, I realized this, pretty early on. So I started to reject these people quite quickly, but it did have an impact on me. And I definitely see how so many people could be like seduced by these new atheist ways of thinking, especially to do with Islam, because it really did seem like they were saying the unpopular thing, but it was kind of hard to argue against. And my YouTube channel actually started off as like a leftist atheist channel before I shifted to like politics and anti-capitalism. And today I am still like a massive atheist. I had some leftist Muslims calling me like racist on my video about Sneeko and Andrew Tate. And it just reminded me of being like an atheist YouTuber, like being called racist for having like a nuanced view, but ultimately thinking like religion is bad for humans, like makes me a racist. It is quite funny. But yeah, I still think religion is terrible for humanity. I still think people shouldn't be religious. I think people who are like communists like myself should see how organized religion has really propped up the power structures of capitalism. A lot of Protestantism really feeds into things like neoliberalism and the Protestant work ethic and stuff like that. So fundamentally, I think religion is bad for humanity, bad for the world, props up capitalism. I don't see many redeeming things about it, but also at the same time, capitalism is a thing I see as the worst evil in the world. And if loads of leftist Muslims and Christians can agree with that, then I will happily ally with those people. And on an individual level, if you have good politics, I really don't care if you believe there is like a sky god, if you believe in like Allah, if you believe in Odin or Vishnu. I really couldn't care less. I just mainly think about organized religion. But I kind of spoke about the context of new atheism, and we kind of have to like analyze the historical context for their rise. So of course, in like the leftist framing of me attacking religion, you kind of have that tradition with communists in the past, because communists often saw organized religion as a hotbed of anti-communism, of fascism, and of capitalism. And although I don't agree with how religious minorities have been treated in certain communist states in the past, I would say they weren't wrong in some of their assessments that things like the Catholic Church have been things that have propped up fascism, have supported fascism throughout the world. So in that context, I kind of saw where Marxists have been coming from the entire time. But with the collapse of like the Soviet Union and the collapse of like the broader like communist world, it seemed that like leftist atheism, or more like left-leaning attacks on atheism, had really kind of been stifled a bit. Also at a similar time to the fall of the communist bloc was the emergence of American evangelicism as a major political force. And of course, who unleashed this on America? It was Ronald Reagan. It seems like there never could have been a time in American history where millions of people, even like tens of millions of people who could vote Democrat, could vote Republican. But in the past, this happened. You could switch between the parties because on certain things, they didn't seem so wildly different. But as we've got on from the Reagan years, both parties seem so different. And that mainly is because of the evangelical base that these people caught. So, of course, Reagan unleashed this. Both Bushes capitalized on this as well. And then you have someone who seems more religious, like George Bush Jr. put in the White House. And evangelicals absolutely loved that. And then in record numbers, they voted for Donald Trump as well. And that's why the American Republican Party since the 1980s has seemed like absolutely insane and has unleashed this political force, because although it seems like based on this, American Christians are like mostly insane, it isn't really true. But it is true that because of capitalism, a lot of wealthy evangelicals have really been able to influence American politics, like the Supreme Court, for example. What the Supreme Court did with Roe was against the wishes of like 70% of Americans, regardless of political affiliation, right? They really are doing the work of rich evangelical Christians and to a lesser extent, rich Catholics as well. But it's in this context the original New Atheists rose, because they were fighting back against this insane American evangelicism. And you see people like Hitchens and Dawkins especially are people who would constantly debate fundamentalist Christians in America, and that is what got them so popular, because they were pushing back against people who seem to have really, really regressive social attitudes in the face of like a Western world on the surface that seemed like it was heading in a more progressive and tolerant direction. This is when Dawkins and Hitchens kind of exploded in popularity as like these fighters against American evangelicism. And when you have things like the War on Terror, which is kind of like a double boon to these people, and this is where Sam Harris comes from as well, because not only do you have fundamentalist Islam like attacking places in the West, the response to that is also more insane US Christianity. These people now have two institutions to attack. Yes, they can attack like the terrible Islamic insurgents, but now they can also attack like this crazed American nationalism, which is heavily intertwined with this hysterical American Christianity. And the heyday of like New Atheists is really like the 2000s and the early 2010s, where they seem so vindicated and that religion was really destroying the world and bringing the world to the brink. And like 2006, 7, 8, this is when the books these people wrote were getting really, really popular. And I think why a lot of progressive people were often drawn to New Atheism originally was because of their anti-Christian stance and their anti-American fundamentalist Christian stance, like fighting back against all the social things they wanted to take away from people, all the attacks on women's rights, gay rights, and stuff like that. So it felt like a lot of New Atheism was fairly progressive. And it feels like in atheist communities generally, socially at least, a lot of these people are more progressive and they are supportive of progressive causes, because what they see is that religion is the thing that is driving us into a more conservative direction socially. But then you have like the Arab Spring, then you have, you know, the civil war in Iraq, and these people seem even more vindicated, but they change who their target is. Obviously, Hitchens died in 2010, but then you have Harris and Dawkins and people like Bill Maher, and they're basically saying like, we've been vindicated on Islam. Like, Islam is destroying Western civilization. It's a major threat to Western civilization. And they were basically framing Islam from poor countries as much a threat to the social progressiveness of the West as American Christian fundamentalists. But of course, you guys will start to see the problem there, is that Muslims in the West do not have political power and don't have social power, where fundamentalist Christians in America are still destroying America today. Overturning Roe happened recently, right? But a lot of it was motivated by Western chauvinism and their own bigotry. So that's kind of like a nice jumping off point of like how these people became very, very relevant, and how these people had like two surges in popularity, fighting back against Christian fundamentalism in America, and then fighting back against like Islamic insurgents during this whole period in the mid 2000s to like, you know, the mid 2010s and stuff like that. But of course, you guys might be thinking, like, these people aren't popular anymore. Like, who really talks about Sam Harris or Richard Dawkins beside, like, some odd news articles you might see once in a while? And now we have to kind of talk about, like, the reasons why New Atheism died from the lofty heights of 2005 to 2015, I guess. And I was reading an article kind of about this today, and I'm going to read parts of it. So why is atheism no longer cool? So these days, New Atheism has gone quiet, but the quiet isn't the real issue. The real issue was it began to look like a cult. P.Z. Myers, a biologist and assistant professor, charts his fascinating change from signed-up New Atheist to bruised survivor on the Free Thoughts blog. He explains that he and others began to recognise the inherent Islamophobia of the movement and began to worry that there was a mangling of evolutionary science to fit the objectives of damning God. In a touching postscript, Myers said that his dalliance with New Atheism was the greatest regret of his life, not because he was part of a movement that laid into God, but because he was part of something that mangled science to promote racism, sexism, and bloody regressive politics. Before lockdown, I went into one of London's finest independent bookshops and had an illuminating talk with the staff. First up, only 2 of the 4 horsemen are in stock. We only sell the odd Dawkins, but very few. I asked what happened. It was mainly due to publishers. They all jumped on the bandwagon at the start, but they began to lose interest as sales dropped. Atheism looked like it'd be a whole new sales category, but it didn't last long. Here's where it gets more fascinating. These days, the question, is a god a delusion, isn't relevant. No one's really interested. They get their truth from elsewhere than books on atheism, from statistics, books on justice and the environment. It's had its day. I do find that really interesting. And like I said, these people are kind of like relegated to being like in outrage headlines. Like Richard Dawkins wrote an article for The Spectator talking about like sticking up for science while attacking like stuff in New Zealand, which are trying to promote Maori language. Richard Dawkins declares there are only 2 sexes as a matter of science. That's all there is to it. Dawkins added that those who have tried to cancel J.K. Rowling for making the same point are bullies, which he told Piers Morgan on Fox News. Like, this is where he's getting his credibility these days. With Sam Harris, he's really only popping into the headlines now because even though he is like a Western chauvinist, he hates Donald Trump and he hates like the Trumpist conservatives. So he recently attacked them in a podcast with like Lex Fridman. So they were all like reacting to it and like making responses to it. And this is how they're just not relevant anymore. Like no one cares about them, really. I know they have successful books and podcasts. And in my opinion, Richard Dawkins' greatest achievement is like being the inspiration for the plot of Metal Gear Solid 2 and Metal Gear Rising. And to be honest, he's always seemed like a moody guy. I doubt he even cares he's as famous or relevant anymore. But now I just want to talk about like how have we gone from these two being extremely popular online to being more like irrelevant. Like Sam Harris on his own podcast, Richard Dawkins going on Fox News with Piers Morgan, like who really cares? And we have like multiple things I want to talk about. I'm going to try and segment them into 3 different things. So I've got the focus on Islam, anti-left content, and cozying up with the far right to attack the left. And some of these points kind of cross over. I'm going to try and keep them separate and we'll see how we go. So we've already kind of talked about it. The focus on Islam is where a lot of these people got a second wind in the early 2010s. And it kind of culminated with Sam Harris and Bill Maher attacking Ben Affleck together on Bill Maher's show, where Ben Affleck was saying like their characterization of Muslims and stuff was racist and they were pushing back against it. And when I was younger, I would say I would have more agree with like Bill Maher and Sam Harris. And I made a whole video about this like over a year ago. I said I now probably would agree more with Ben Affleck because I realized these people were Western chauvinists. And the focus on Islam is really interesting. And like I said, this is how Sam Harris even got like prominent in the first place with his original work. But the focus on Islam, I think, shows where these people are really lacking. Because yes, they are Western chauvinists, but they also lack a real geopolitical understanding. Like, you know, I have a master's in international relations and I'm an anti-capitalist. So a lot of my problems with Islam, shall we say, if you re-deconstruct it, it's a problem with capitalism. So we have a country like Saudi Arabia, one of the most extreme Muslim countries out there, also one of the wealthiest countries in the world, right? And they're allowed to spread their version of Islam throughout the world, pretty much unchecked. No one really cares. Why? Because they have loads of oil. They're in bed with Israel, the United States. When it looked like Saddam Hussein was threatening to invade Saudi Arabia in 1990, the US literally sent troops to protect their oil fields in Operation Desert Shield, right? Like, that is the alliance these guys have. Therefore, there is no reason to criticize this system. But a lot of the time in Western discourse, we see a lot of the same criticisms applied to Iran, right? Say Iran is terrible, backwards, all this stuff, right? And although that is true, the reason Iran gets a disproportionate focus is because it's an enemy of the US and it's allied with like Russia and to a lesser extent China and like North Korea and stuff like that. So it's easy to demonize them and attack like Muslims as a whole based on Iran. But a lot of people don't want to do that with Saudi Arabia or various Gulf monarchies that are on the side of the US. And why? Because of capitalism. Saudi Arabian companies now have a massive influence in Western economies, Western banks, Western football teams. It wouldn't be a good idea to start cracking down on the Islamicism they spread. And also what a lot of these new atheists like to do was justify their bigotry and Western chauvinism based on like polling of poor countries. And what I've always said in this is a lot of Muslim countries are poor anyway, right? Like they are poorer countries, especially in the MENA region. Also, a lot of them live under dictatorships as well. And these dictatorships are often like backed by the West. So Egypt is a perfect example. So Egypt isn't one of like the most conservative Muslim countries ever, but it is a country that has lived under 2 military dictatorships backed by the US. We had Mubarak and now we have Sisi. These people make the country worse. They don't have freedom of speech, and because it's poorer, access to information is harder. Freedom of information is not great either. I think this creates conditions where people just remain ignorant, and they do remain more socially conservative because they don't have this narrative challenge. Like, despite the fact that Sisi, Mubarak, they were against things like the Muslim Brotherhood, who were more conservative, because they keep the region poor and because they loot the country for them and their friends at the behest of the US, then what's going to happen there? And throughout the world, you kind of see this. And also then you have like invasions of various countries, like Iraq, for example, right? Like if you're going to destroy these countries that are already poor or dictatorships, you're just going to allow Islamicism and fanatical religion to flourish. And that's what the US has done. But to Bill Maher, Sam Harris, Dawkins, and people like that, no, it's because Islam is fundamentally worse. It's not compatible. These people are all just insane fundamentally because of the religion, not because the average person in the Islamic world is poorer, has a worse education, might live in a dictatorship, and doesn't have access as much to things like the internet and freedom of information. That's what can create these conditions to make people more conservative. Of course, it's not a perfect analysis because loads of rich Saudis believe in like some of the worst forms of religion ever. Loads of rich Americans do as well. But I think it does a good job at explaining how these populations are often kept very socially conservative in this way. Pakistan is another example. In Asia, of course, places in Afghanistan as well. But in my Sneeko and Andrew Tate video, I said, Andrew Tate and Sneeko are saying the Orientalist view of Islam is actually a good thing, right? And the Orientalist Islam was spread by people like Sam Harris, that Islam is the most dangerous religion because of what's in it, and you cannot trust these people. They're all like more supportive of violence and things like that. And this view became very, very dominant. And also for people who used to fight back against the Christian right because of their like homophobia, intolerance, they got more like leftist support. But then they start demonizing all these people. And I guess in new atheist minds, they're like, well, I'm just being consistent, right? Why would I demonize all these US Christian leaders and US Christians as backwards bigots, but not apply the same reasoning to the Muslim countries or Muslims in general? But I think the framing is problematic is because they focus on the West. Sam Harris doesn't really talk about like the factionalism in Egypt. He doesn't talk about like Muslim Brotherhood versus the Ba'ath Party or like Muslim Brotherhood versus Arab Socialists. He doesn't talk about it like that. He talks about Muslims versus West. And that's where the problem comes, because he's not analyzing things through the lens of geopolitics and capitalism and poverty. They have this Orientalist view of Muslims, which means they think Western secular democracy should be protected, and they're very willing to overlook things that these Western democracies do, as we're going to see, praising Poland and praising Donald Trump being one of them. But one more thing I want to focus on, where they're focused on Islam itself. New atheists support Israel, which is insane, and Sam Harris is chief among them. I've made a whole video on it.
Again, you have to ask yourself, what do these groups want? What would they accomplish if they could accomplish anything? What would the Israelis do if they could do what they want? They would live in peace with their neighbors, if they had neighbors who would live in peace with them. They would simply continue to build out their high-tech sector and thrive. And yet, judging from the level of condemnation that Israel now receives, you would think the difference ran the other way. This kind of confusion puts us all in danger. This is the great story of our time. For the rest of our lives, and the lives of our children, we're going to be confronted by people who don't want to live peacefully in a secular, pluralistic world, because they are desperate to get to paradise, and they're willing to destroy the very possibility of human happiness along the way. The truth is, we are all living in Israel. It's just that some of us haven't realized it yet.
New atheists supporting Israel is just crazy to me if you're an atheist who's trying to have some sort of consistency in your mind, like, oh, I attack Christians, I attack Muslims whether they are, But no, not Israel, because what they see Israel is West, and Israel is a secular Western democracy. Hilariously, they think that. So therefore, Israel should be protected because the people fighting against Israel are Islamic insurgents, and if they took over Israel, it would be a worse place for Israelis. So you feel like it's a zero-sum game, right? You either pick Islamic insurgents or you pick Israeli government. And if you have any degree of nuance, you know that's not the case. You first know that the PLO were more secular anyway. And I honestly think a lot of their attraction to Israel is because Israel was founded by secular Zionists, even atheist Zionists. They didn't actually care about the religious justification for Zionism, and religious Zionism as a mainstream political force really comes to the forefront of Israeli politics in like the 1960s and 1970s, not so much at the start. And now you see in Israel today, although Israel was already a fascist state for the Palestinians, it's literally becoming one for Israelis now as well, because people like Netanyahu have really courted and allowed this fanatical religious Zionism to flourish. But Sam Harris would still see that as a better alternative to anything to do with Muslims because, again, Israel, West, Israel, secular. You can be an atheist in Israel, you can be gay in Israel, so therefore, Israel better. And it really, really shows these guys fundamentally do not understand geopolitics, and they don't want to have nuance when it would undermine their agenda. So to a lot of people like me, when we're talking about why New Atheism died, that's part of the reason, right? Because if New Atheism was more nuanced on things like, I don't know, dictatorships, capitalism, foreign policy, then we wouldn't be completely turned off by it. People like Sam Harris wouldn't be seen as a Western chauvinist. The whole movement wouldn't be seen as like racist and xenophobic. But because we have people like Sam Harris treating these issues like that, that's why people got turned off from New Atheism, and that's why people moved away from it. Like, as an atheist myself, a left-wing anti-capitalist atheist, yeah, I recognize the problems with fanatical religion. I also realize how things, even in Israel, are really motivated by things like capitalism or geopolitics, which often is, you know, really intertwined with capitalism. But a lot of our attraction originally, someone who's an ex-Catholic, is because they were criticizing Christianity as backward, and these groups with institutional power, like the Catholic Church around the world or various Christian churches in America. But when you switch that up and start saying West is good, Muslims all bad, and Muslims are just as much of a threat to you in England as like the Church of England and stuff, which is not true. And it really shows you that these people are motivated by xenophobia, which is why they cozied up with the far right later on. And that moves into like the third point, which I want to expand on a lot more, which is cozying up with the far right to attack the left. Now, you guys remember, there used to be a thing called the intellectual dark web, characterized by people like Sam Harris, Brett Weinstein, Joe Rogan even, Dave Rubin, and of course people like Douglas Murray. And also I guess like kind of related was like Richard Dawkins. And this was a meeting of people from a variety of different backgrounds. And a fair few of them were atheists. I would say most of them were atheists, but then you had some Christians in there, like Jordan Peterson, for example. And they would talk about like all these issues, have these deep, boring, philosophical, I don't know, conversations about everything. And it was pretty clear the way the new atheist movement was going. And I guess for a lot of people, this is where you either jumped ship and just rejected it, or you carried on and started treating Jordan Peterson like he was credible. And I think for a lot of people, this is the moment where they're like, I can't support these people anymore. Like, I don't want to watch Sam Harris collaborating with Ben Shapiro, talking about how great Israel is and stuff, because I thought as new atheists, we were meant to attack organized religion. Here is someone like Ben Shapiro, promotes like a conservative form of Judaism, and also promotes like the state of Israel no matter what. Like, that's not what we're here for. So that's a reason why it died as well. But then you have Sam Harris especially going into some really like far right territory. So first of all, we actually got Charles Murray on his podcast where they talked about the bell curve. And I made a whole video about this, about like why the far right love the new atheist movement. And basically, Sam Harris was saying very, very positive things about the bell curve, saying how people had never entertained that it could be like real, and people didn't really look at the evidence, because if you looked at the evidence, it was quite compelling.
People don't want to hear that intelligence is a real thing. People don't want to hear that a person's intelligence is in large measure due to his or her genes, and that there seems to be very little we can do environmentally to increase a person's intelligence, even in childhood. It's not that the environment doesn't matter, but genes appear to be 50 to 80% of the story. People don't want to hear this. And they certainly don't want to hear that average IQ differs across races and ethnic groups.
Remember, this is a work that says race and IQ have some sort of correlation. In essence, black people are genetically more stupid than white people, right? If that raises red flags to you, and you also know the history of IQ as well, IQ, which is for skull measurers and has like a really racist history, you know this work is probably bullshit. But if you want a thorough debunking, Sean has done a whole video about the bell curve. But even before Sam Harris had this guy on, it'd been thoroughly debunked. Like, no one was taking this seriously. It wasn't like a question the whole world was debating. Essentially, like a fringe guy who had his work debunked is clearly very, very racist based on his own work. And Sam Harris was treating this very, very seriously. Now, one thing I haven't really spoke about, because I was saving it for this section, is Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. And the reason I saved it is because we're talking more about Sam Harris here rather than Richard Dawkins. Now, The Clash of Civilizations was a work written in the early 90s by Samuel Huntington, which basically said, now the Cold War is over, it's going to be a clash between like Western secular democracy and actually the Islamic world. And people need to remember, even though Samuel Huntington did talk a bit about China in a lot of his work, no one really thought China would become a global superpower by the time we're living in, right? So people were very surprised in like 2008 when China started emerging as one of the top world economies. And back in the day, people didn't really envision like a new kind of Cold War between China and the United States, or I don't know, China, Russia, and the BRIC countries and the United States possibly happening. So they thought, no, it's actually going to be between the Islamic world and Western civilization. No longer will this Cold War be fought between economic ideologies or national allegiances. It's going to be all about like Western values versus Islamic values. And basically with like Bush and the war on terror, what a lot of people said is Samuel Huntington was right. He's been vindicated. Look, everything he said has come true. Everything he said. And now we're not fighting a war between the United States, NATO, and the Soviet Union and communism and stuff like that. We are fighting a war for the West's very existence. Now, I have a clip of Sam Harris basically parroting some Clash of Civilizations rhetoric. But I read a good article on the Washington Post, Samuel Huntington, a prophet for the Trump era. And why I want to bring this up is because Sam Harris talked about this same speech Trump gave in Poland. And I think it's very telling because what Sam Harris says and what's written here. So we'll start with this. So President Trump's recent speech in Warsaw, in which he urged Europeans and Americans to defend Western civilization against extremists and barbarian hordes, inevitably evoked Samuel P. Huntington's Clash of Civilizations. The notion that superpower rivalry would give way to battles among Western universalism, Islamic militants, and Chinese assertiveness. In a book expanded from his famous 1993 essay, Huntington describes civilizations as the broadest and most crucial level of identity encompassing religion, values, culture, and history. Rather than which side are you on, he wrote, the overriding question in the post-Cold War world would be, who are you? So when the president calls on the nations of the West to summon the courage and the will to defend our civilization, when he insists that we accept only migrants who share our values and love our people, and when he urges the transatlantic alliance to never forget who we are and cling to the bonds of history, culture, and memory, I imagine Huntington, who passed away in 2008, nodding from beyond. It would be a nod of vindication, perhaps, but mainly one of grim recognition. Trump's civilization rhetoric is just one reason Huntington resonates today, and it's not even the most interesting one. In his 1996 book, he writes that the West will continue its slow decline relative to Asia and the Islamic world, while economic dynamism drives Asia's rise. Population growth in Muslim nations provides recruits for fundamentalism, insurgency, and migration. Much as Trump mocks politicians who refuse to decry Islamic insurgents, Huntington criticizes America's leaders such as Bill Clinton, who argue that the West had no quarrel with Islam, only with its insurgents. 1,400 years of history demonstrates otherwise, Huntington remarked. So this is what Huntington wrote. The underlying problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power. The problem for Islam is not the CIA or the Department of Defense. It is the West, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the universality of their culture and believe that their superior, if declining power, imposes on them the obligation to extend that culture throughout the world. So whoever wrote that Trump speech in Poland, if it was Stephen Bannon, probably someone who subscribes to Huntington's belief in the clash of civilizations, Sam Harris is clearly another person who does believe in this and does believe there is a Western war against Islam. And he sees Islam as this monolith that wants to colonize the world and subjugate it to Sharia law, undoing all the good things the West has done. And the West is like some uniquely amazing part of the world. And also, you guys will even see Trump going to Poland and talking about Western values and stuff. It's like, well, Sam Harris, I'm pretty sure I've heard you talk about like Western values of liberalism. Poland is not a liberal place right now. Poland's government is not liberal. Donald Trump was not liberal. So what are they defending here? I'm not in any alliance with people like Donald Trump and the Polish far-right government to defend some notion of Western values. It seems to me to be a dog whistle about Christianity or about white supremacy. But anyway, Sam Harris did an interview with Douglas Murray, who's notorious for being like this far-right Western chauvinist who does hate Muslims as well. But I think it's interesting what Sam Harris opened their podcast with, because he talked about this speech. And like I said, very much echoes something that Samuel Huntington might agree with.
Douglas and I spent a lot of time in this podcast, certainly most of the time, talking about the situation in Europe with respect to immigration and Islam and the social attitudes in the Muslim community that are at odds with values that really must be non-negotiable, like free speech and women's rights and gay rights. And what I'd like to point out is that neither of us are against immigration. And you might not notice that in the first hour or so. And we're not against Muslim immigration. In fact, both of us count among our friends Muslims and former Muslims who are precisely the sorts of people we are most concerned to protect. And in particular, we're worried about protecting them from many of the illiberal people who have been pouring into Europe. In this one, we more or less fully agree on what we're against. And what we're against is Western civilization committing sin. And if you think that puts the matter too strongly, you haven't read Douglas's book, and you probably haven't been paying much attention to what's been happening in Europe. And if you think one has to be a fan of Trump in order to worry about this, well, then you haven't been paying attention to this podcast. But on the topic of Trump, Trump just gave a speech in Poland where he said, and I quote, "The fundamental question of our time is whether the West has the will to survive. Do we have the confidence in our values to defend them at any cost? Do we have enough respect for our citizens to protect our borders? Do we have the desire and the courage to preserve our civilization in the face of those who would subvert or destroy it?" End quote. And while I find abundant fault with the messenger, as you know, I can't find fault with that particular message. And the fact that liberals can't seem to see what's at stake here, the fact that they are embarrassed to defend, quote, Western values, as though that were synonymous with racism, or the legacy of colonialism, or xenophobia, or a lack of compassion, that is making liberalism politically defunct at this point. And that increasingly worries me. And happily in the United States, we are in a better situation demographically and with respect to immigration and just geographically. And that has implications for immigration. But one cannot be cheerful about what's been happening in Europe.
So where do you even start with that? Of course, pretty racist. And at the end, he's saying, yeah, America's in a better position because we have less Muslims in Europe. Like, we have less Muslims in America than the whole of the UK. We have less Muslims in France. We have less Muslims in loads of European countries. So we're pretty good right now. We're pretty good because if we had loads of Muslims, then the West would be destroyed. Our liberal values would be destroyed. How's that working out for you? Look at Ron DeSantis in Florida attacking all these liberal values. Look at Donald Trump's presidency. Like I said as well, look at Roe versus Wade. Look at all these Republican governments in various states ripping rights away from women, gay people, trans people, right? Muslims aren't doing that. Christians are doing that. The same Christians used to fight against, and now you're saying we should ally with them. We should ally with people like Donald Trump and Douglas Murray to protect the West. What West? The people in the West taking away people's rights. aren't Muslims, aren't Muslim refugees, aren't poor Muslim people who escape like war, poverty, famine, and maybe threats of violence to come to the West, right, and just live a normal life. These aren't the people who threaten us. And he's talking about like demographics, so does Douglas Murray, and how Muslim populations growing in Europe will create, I don't know, Sharia law or something. What's so funny though, is the Muslim monolith they've invented would happily collaborate with loads of these supposed defenders of Western democracy and liberalism. They'd happily collab with the Republican government to take away rights from gay people and trans people and women. So what is their real issue there? And it really shows how these people don't have nuanced ways of thinking. It's just, oh yeah, Muslims bad, West good. Despite the fact that if we're going to talk about the destruction of the West as this imagined entity of liberal democracy, who's destroying it? The far right. People who are very religious a lot of the time, Christian far right in places like Poland, which Sam Harris seems to think is some sort of beacon of Western democracy when it really, really isn't. Across the Western world, we're seeing the far right take away our rights, attack our liberal values, the Tory government in the UK. It really just shows the brain rot with New Atheism is that they think the West has entered some stage of like enlightenment, and we can all agree certain things are true. We can all agree collectively as a society, gay people should have equal rights, trans people should have equal rights. Recently, you see with New Atheism what it became. I think that clip there really encapsulates everything I wanted to say, in that that's why New Atheism has become irrelevant. That's why New Atheism died. Because when these people were popular, they were fighting against institutional, bigoted power, like the American Christian right. And a lot of left-wing people would listen to their arguments and say, I totally agree with you. I totally agree with you going after these powerful figures and challenging them. And as a left-wing person, as a progressive person who supports liberal values, I'm with you. And like I said, even in the early 2000s, a lot of these people were still pretty decent at this because they saw what America was becoming under George Bush. And in that context, that's when New Atheists became even more popular because they were fighting back against these people, against these Christians abusing their power. But when it started coming to like the refugee crisis from like Libya and Syria, when it came to the Iraq Civil War in 2014, they started changing it. Well, the Christians aren't threats anymore because, I don't know, Obama's in office and stuff. So I guess it's the Muslims now. The Muslims are the biggest threat. And like I said, please give me an example in a Western country where Muslim people have been responsible for eroding our rights. Or even a Muslim politician. I cannot even think of one. So their brains are so rotted by a hatred of religion, which in a lot of ways I share, that they cannot analyse things without putting that to the forefront, and they don't care if it's racist or not. And that's the fundamental thing that killed New Atheism, is that I feel like most atheist people in my life have been progressive. Most people who are atheists, become atheists, do at least subscribe to liberal values. And in a lot of cases, I think we share a lot of left-wing values, like leftist values, communists. A lot of Western communists I know are also atheists, especially from places like the UK. So I feel like atheism should be a progressive ideology, and you can see why originally progressive people were attracted to New Atheism. But just as that article said at the start, like I said from my own journey with New Atheism, and like you can clearly see with Sam Harris's rhetoric, the reason so many people shun New Atheism because it was inherently racist, xenophobic, and a Western chauvinist ideology, and that's why so many of them started allying with the far right in America, the same people they would be fighting against like 10 years prior. So the thing is, I don't even lament the death of New Atheism. I don't lament the death of atheism being more popular in like the discourse or in the media, because if this is the form of atheism we get, I don't really care, to be honest. And also, I feel like now, as also that little article said, people now focus more on like environmental politics, the climate, and even for me, I care way more about anti-capitalism now. Like, capitalism for me is ruining our lives, is destroying the planet, like literally destroying the planet. Why would I focus all my energy on anti-religion and stuff like that, or strictly promoting atheist content, when I feel increasingly it's becoming like kind of irrelevant, although it's still important, especially for like analysing like far-right religious movements in places like Poland, in places like India or Brazil with Bolsonaro, and of course in Israel right now. I think it's just part of the analysis of a lot of things going on in our world. Rather, what New Atheists often used to think is it's the main thing and it's the most important thing. And I used to think that too when I was like 19 years old, 27 now, and I really don't think that. So honestly, I think it's a lot of factors why New Atheism died. I don't think it's all self-inflicted. I just felt like they kind of rode the waves of history in the late 1990s, in the mid-2000s, and in the early 2010s to prominence, but then attracted like a certain group of people who then realized quickly that, oh, these people do not represent my actual like social values, political values. Just because we can agree that all religion is bad, it's not really a replacement for a political ideology. And although, like I said, I feel like atheism generally draws in more, progressive people. Richard Spencer was an atheist. Loads of terrible far-right people are atheists too. Just rejecting religion is not enough for a political ideology. It's not enough for an analysis of geopolitics, politics in general. You have to have a more multifaceted approach, and that's why I think New Atheism died, and New Atheism is pretty much dead, including its most prominent figures becoming more and more irrelevant. So anyway, that is it for the video. Let me know what you guys think down in the comments, and if you made it this far, thank you for watching.